9. Well, hello from wherever you are. Welcome to this presentation of mine on the learning brain and memory. Now, of course, we all need to learn. And part of learning, of course, is being able to memorize, to recall. And of course, eventually, hopefully, we're recalling something useful that we can apply, become more knowledgeable, and so on. But I often tell my students, we don't actually learn in the classroom. And then they sort of think, well, I'm in the classroom, surely I'm learning. But it's a bit of a puzzle question. I say, no, in actual fact, the learning takes place in the brain. You are in the classroom, the brain is in you. The classroom is just something, but the learning actually takes place in the brain. So that's why I want to start focusing a little bit on our thinking, our learning, and then we'll go on a bit to learning styles, for example, and then memory techniques, memory enhancement, and so on. So my talk should take about no longer than 20 minutes, and I have a number of slides that I would like to show. And so the first one, well, that's just a picture of me, and there is my email there, because if later you don't get slides, I'll want you to, you can email me. But I like to start with this little question posed, do we think to learn, or do we learn to think? Or is it actually both, chicken or egg story, if you will. Now, we're born with instinctual behaviors, and learning tends to be one of them. Our brain is wired up to learn. We're naturally curious. Just think of any children that you ever experienced, and they're always asking, why, okay? But the brain is also naturally programmed, or not programmed, wired up, if you will, to use the language, and maybe more than one language, but usually we'll have something called our mother tongue. And so what happens is we start actually learning right in the womb. We're not really thinking at that point. And when we're born, we're still really more learning than thinking, because we don't get to use and understand fully the language, in the first couple of years. And then as we master the language, our learning really starts to take off. So then, of course, we start thinking. So if we have improved thinking, we can have improved learning. But of course, we can learn to think better as well. And so this is really what I wanted to do. And I think that what we want to do is define learning. And there are several definitions, but one popular one is that it creates change of behavior. Now, it could be appropriate behavior, but that can also, behavior can also be thinking. Even learning is behavior. But I think also we want to move into how we're going to do that. And so there's this famous quotation by Benjamin Disraeli: as we think, so we become. But I would like to modify that a little bit, or add to it perhaps. It's not only as we think, so we become, but also as we feel, so we become. Because it's the emotional brain that is really absolutely critical to learning and memory. and we'll be looking at this as we go along. Creating positive emotional connections will strengthen our memories. And so, as I prefer to say, as I feel, so I become. Now, there are many types and models of learning, and I won't go through these in detail. They're on the slide for you to look at, but we talk generally about, active or passive, conscious, subconscious, and so on. And then the models of learning, the competency model, adult versus child, what we sometimes call is andragogy versus pedagogy, action learning, experiential learning, and so on. And linking this then to the brain. Now, as I think we would all know, the brain is split, not physically split, but we have a left hemisphere and we have a right hemisphere. And so the brain is a bit like, our fist here, with the left and the right. And so you actually see a little diagram of that. Now, of course, the left and the right hemispheres are actually integrated. They're joined by a piece of tissue called the corpus callosum. It's like a super fiber optic cable, all right, that iterates at zillionths of a second, again, between the left and the right. And so that we would call, when it's fully integrated, whole brain learning. Although we're switching from left to right from time to time, okay? Now, there has been quite a bit of controversy over this left-right hemisphere learning and whether it is really all it is cracked up to be. Very fashionable several years ago. And it's only very recently that some research has been done by an Oxford scholar, and he has tended to now prefer to use EEG, electroencephalograph, rather than the functional MRI, because he's found that the timing of our thinking and learning and activity in the brain, which if you're just processing a couple of words will be in milliseconds, but over a period of a lecture, all right, maybe many minutes, then EEG can capture that, whereas functional magnetic resonance cannot. It's just a quick instant slice. So this has really sort of restored the concept, sort of brought it back into hopefully being more fashionable, that we do and can and often prefer to use one hemisphere, one side of the brain or the other. So another model of the brain, looking at it from a different viewpoint, sort of sliced down the middle, is that it actually comprises 3 layers. And so there's what's called the reptilian brain, which is almost an extension of our spinal cord and very small in mass, about 10%. Then there's the limbic system. We might call it the emotional brain. So we have the instinctive and then the emotional. And this is where I will be talking more about that as being very important for memory. And then, of course, the ultimate processing, where a lot of the thinking goes on in the cerebral cortex, actually about 80% of the mass of our brain. So linked, as I said before, by a piece of tissue. So again, if you take this sort of vertical slice, you can see the corpus callosum literally cut in half here, but it's like spread out, across both sides of the hemispheres, linking them. So of course, we mentioned the thinking brain, the cerebral cortex, divided into some loads, but there's also the limbic system, the emotional brain. And this is where memories are very much processed before they are shunted up into the thinking brain. In fact, what it is important to appreciate is that everything we sense from our five senses, you know, seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling, so on, all goes into the emotional brain first. So the emotional brain, in a way, is acting as a gateway. And if it's safe, you know, if whatever we're sensing appears to be safe, then the gateway opens and it goes up into our thinking brain. Of course, this all takes place in split seconds. So then we have the emotional brain itself, the feeling brain, the limbic system. And what's important there is there are sort of three major components of this. So there is something called the hippocampus, and then there is the amygdala, or the Americans call it the amygdala, and then the thalamus. Thalamus is like, as I said before, you know, the gateway. But it is the amygdala that processes initially whether whatever we sense is safe. And it activates whether we, what are sometimes called the 3 Fs, whether we freeze, like maybe we're out walking in the morning and we come across a snake, right? And we freeze. Or we fight, we attack, or we flee. So what are called the 3 Fs. But if everything is safe and we don't have to freeze, fly, or fight, then it goes into the, whatever we're sensing goes into our cognitive and thinking brain. So coming back then to the hemispheres, this is an old classic picture. You've probably seen it yourselves umpteen times. But I often ask people, would they prefer to be on the left side, which is very sort of linear and logical, okay, it's where the facts are processed and so on, or would you prefer to be over on the right, where, of course, in this picture, people are having fun and playing and so on. And it's the non-verbal, non-visual synthesis of ideas and thoughts and so on that are going on. But you can see those little bridges, the corpus callosum, but there's also a bridge between the left and the right limbic system, the emotional brain. Now, that's a little bit about learning and brain. And of course, it's important that realizing the topic is the learning brain and memory, that we look at memory for a second. And memory has often been divided into categories. And so here we're just showing 4. The very short-term memory, you know, just sometimes only a few seconds, long enough to remember a telephone number. And yet the moment we're interrupted, it's lost. So it's very easy to lose short-term memory or very short-term memory. Then there's the short-term, but really as teachers, as learning facilitators, what we're interested in is the midterm, where we're often is called the processing, the working memory. And eventually, of course, if we're going to be able to recall it, and recall it maybe hours, days, weeks, months, years down the road, then of course, we want to fix things into the long term, okay? So we've got those 4, they're almost like phases. Now, some of those memories are processed in the left hemisphere, some in the right, okay? As I'm talking about, like getting words, making meaning out of them, and so on. whereas the visual components can be more on the right. We also find that if learning is to be successful, it is good that we make it multisensory and use as many of the intelligences that we possess. And I'm sure many of you have come across Dr. Howard Gardner's famous multiple intelligences model, where initially he had 7 and then 8. And of course, there are others, but these were the primary ones. Now, I won't go through all 7, but they do represent, you know, the language, the linguistic, the logical, the mathematical, and of course, the interpersonal, and even the intra, you know, processing how you're feeling, you know, about what you're learning. So now, I mentioned earlier, we would talk about learning styles, and there has also been some controversy over that. But again, I think because of the newer research on the left and right hemisphere, they have found that we as individuals, as people, with our personality and our genes, nature and nurture, we tend to evolve or develop a preferred style of learning. And this now is what we might call learning style. But it is something that we have either consciously programmed our mind to sort of learn a particular way, and then later just almost subconsciously, automatically, we have that chosen preference. And so we will go a little bit into some of these. There are several models and theories. I'm only really going to touch on probably 2, the Herman Wholebrain model of, you know, the rational and the emotional, and the left and the right of these 2, and 2 other people, educationists, doctors, Kenneth and Rita Dunn. And so they just simplified it into 2 areas, the analytic or the left brain, and the what they call global, the right brain. Of course, there is neuro-linguistic programming, NLP, which also has its own model of styles, you know, from visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and even now digital. So coming back to Dunn and Dunn, they did a massive study, a large study, thousands of students in their teens. And what they found was that out of those 3, what we sometimes call haptic or kinesthetic, the moving, touching, doing, feeling, this was slightly higher among teens, about 37% of the group that he was measuring. Auditory became number 2 at about 34%, and the visual slightly less, just under 30%, 29%. Now, teens, therefore, we know, need to move, and they've got to be active. As we mature, as our personality and age matures and so on, we might tend to favor one of these over the other. For example, I'm primarily an auditory, then visual, and then haptic. Whereas, for example, my wife tends to be the kinesthetic first, then visual, and then auditory. So both of us knowing this is very useful because we approach things from a different viewpoint. And therefore, that is what we might call our preferred learning style differences. And so it's important for teachers to definitely understand this among their learners, among their students. And so then there's the question is, well, which are you better at? Visual or auditory? As I was saying, I tend to be auditory and then visual. And what this shows is that you find is initially and immediately auditory is first. You know, I hear a word and I process it. But later visual we tend to be able to recall better and longer, you know, later the auditory. And so maybe say 10 minutes later, the auditory is slightly less than the visual, okay? Now, if we move on to the next, oops, sorry, I gone too many. So the implications then, as I've already just mentioned, is that we need to understand these, but it's good also to understand the personality differences of people, their temperament, their strong drives. And again, coming back to the intelligences, which are more nature than nurture. So in other words, our IQ is very strongly genetic, whereas something called EQ is a little less so. And so it's good for us to understand our own self in that sense. Now, moving along a bit on to aspects of learning, there has been quite a bit of research done on sleep learning. And it's been found now that sleep is absolutely critical to memory processing and good memory, and especially good long-term memory. So I don't have a lot of time to go into all the details, but remembering that there are different types of sleep. One of them is called dream sleep or rapid eye movement or REM sleep. And this is the part of the sleep that is absolutely critical. And it tends to happen in about 90-minute cycles throughout the night. So the longer our sleep, the more cycles we have, and therefore the better our memory. And so if we're sleep deprived, we're losing at least one cycle, maybe even two, and so that is going to affect our memory. Other studies quite recently, quite interestingly, have been done on the use of learning something with music being played in the background. And so while we have sleep and we have learning, something factored in called music. And at Baylor University in the US, they did some very interesting research quite recently. And they divided groups into divided students into two groups, a test group and a control group. Now, the test group was subjected to some learning, a short talk, lecture, for about 20 minutes. And that is often the optimum, almost maximum, in fact, that people can pay attention. In fact, some people say we start to lose attention after about 10 minutes, unless there's a lot of factors that come into it. We're seeing, touching, tasting, moving, using all our senses and using all our intelligences. But this talk was given 20 minutes, and then some soft background music was played. Now, when the students, both groups, went to sleep, 30 minutes after falling asleep, so about the time that you would have moved into your rapid eye movement sleep, the same music was played to the test group, but of course, not the control group. So the following morning, when the quiz was given to both groups, the test group, who had the background music while they were learning, and the music played during their sleep, so it was probably acting like a trigger to their memory, they did remarkably better, some 40% better than the control group. So this very interesting, fascinating recent research. Another study done a little earlier by Harvard also showed that learning keyboard skills, the speed and the accuracy went up more after a good night's sleep, as against students who were sleep deprived and their keyboard skills were not as sharp, were not as good. Okay. Now, another slide. There is ideal music for studying. I don't have time to go into the detail here, but when you get the slides, you can use this like a checklist, okay? But it tends to be around 60 beats per minute at the resting rate, which is actually the same rate as the ground sound waves. So if you're actually sitting under a tree on the grass learning, you're more in harmony with nature and the natural rhythms that are coming from the ground. And that may be a better environment for learning than a classroom sitting upright in a chair. And talking about sitting, we of course want to try to sustain our attention as best as possible. And so sitting has been found to be important. And if you can sit at about a 45-degree angle, pretty much like I am now, sort of leaning back a little bit in my chair, it seems the body is better, it's more relaxed, it's able to breathe better, the blood flows, and we might say we're feeding the learning brain with good blood flow and being more relaxed. And of course, music is another thing. They done even found that some people need to munch and to nibble and to take some drink and so on. So other research has been done on whether you are what's called, a lark or an owl, a night bird or a morning bird, because our biorhythms may, help us with our mental energy at different times of the day. Now, another aspect of learning that's very important, because we're trying to take something, we're trying to sort of fix it into the memory. And this is called overlearning. And it's good if we can look at this from the viewpoint that there are the sort of layers of learning. If you think of micro skills and micro processes. And so what we need to do is we learn one small thing and we should repeat it over and over and over again. Practice, 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 until it's literally fixed in the brain. Only then should we add on some new learning. So in other words, we don't want to add on new learning too soon, because that might even distort and might even replace the earlier learning. And so the concept of overlearning is another very important viewpoint. Now, before ending up, I would be failing, if I'm talking about memory, in not addressing the idea that even what we eat and drink becomes very, very important. Not only does the brain need oxygen and glucose and a healthy blood supply, all the nutrients that are essential to the learning brain are also taken in by us, by our food, by our nutrition. And so, a healthy diet leads to a healthy brain and therefore healthy learning. And these would be typically some of those foods, very well documented for longevity as well. So not just learning in midlife or even, around retirement or after, but well into the 80s, 90s, and maybe you want to live to become a centenarian. And so your diet is absolutely critical. as is also other things like exercise, but we don't have time to go into that. But one of the drinks that is found to be very, very useful for learning and memory enhancement, as well as longevity and health, a healthy heart, as well as a healthy brain, and mental aspects is coffee. And so you can Google that, go in and search the many benefits of drinking coffee. One more thing is, of course, stress does not help learning and memory. Stress can kill, in fact, memory. And so it's important that we come back to this, what's called the amygdala hijack, that the less stress we have, and therefore the less we're sensing as stressful, the better it is. And one very good example would be called exam nerves. I'm sure most of us at one time in our life or other have experienced going into an examination hall, and we sit there, we open the question paper, we may look at the first question, and then we freeze. Our mind goes blank. We know that we know what we know, but we can't recall it at that moment, because what's happening is the amygdala is blocking us because of the momentary stress. And that's why I tell my students, one of the first things you should do, even before you open the exam paper, is deep breathing, a lot of deep breathing, calm yourself down, be very sort of relaxed. Then you can, look at your exam paper. And also, and in fact, if you can do some mind mapping immediately on the question, that's another technique that's very useful. Before you actually start physically writing, you're mapping out and planning the key points that you want to cover. And a lot of research has been done on this. So mind mapping is another very important memory technique. Now, I don't have enough time to go into the hormones, but we may have heard of dopamine and serotonin, very critical to our learning, and they have different paths. And the dopamine tends to, the path moves into the prefrontal cortex, the cognitive part of the brain, but the serotonin is very much into the other parts of the brain. And we need just the right sort of balance. Not too much serotonin, not too much dopamine. Dopamine is the excitement hormone. Serotonin is the calming one. So getting the right balance. So in a summary, improving memory, a few quick points. Remember, everything we sense first. So the first few words a teacher says, or the exam paper that is facing us, the emotional reaction starts first. Then we can move on to doing other things. So lowering our stress, making sure we've had good sleep, exercise, breathing, nutrition, even posture, and a few other techniques that if you study memory, you will come across. Mnemonics, rhyming, acronyms, melody, and so on. But remember I said earlier, normal attention is in fact only about 10 minutes. And some people are saying that Gen Z even have a shorter attention span because they're exposed to multimedia with quick instant messages, text. We are sort of getting visual stimulus overload a lot of the time. And so it's important that we realize that in order to maintain good attention throughout perhaps the talk I've just been giving now, we need to make sure all those things are there for us. That we have a strong personal interest and motivation, absolutely critical, but the variety, the use of different senses and different intelligences, as I mentioned before. So if time permits, I'm not sure whether it does, I'll have to go back to the moderator in a minute, but I'm happy to ask some questions. Of course, if I don't have time, then you can email me. If you have WhatsApp, you can even WhatsApp me. So my number is there, so take a note of that. But usually with these conferences, the video recordings are captured and often sent to participants afterwards. So we hope you have that. And so with that, I'll sort of wish you farewell. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for listening. And I do hope some learning took place and that you will be able to recall some of these points. But realizing until you go back over the slides again and again and again, and even listen to the talk or other talks on the same topic, you won't get to that extent of what we call mastery in learning and memory. So all the best and farewell. Thanks.